And as we strive to deal with these urgent challenges, whether they're long-standing or newly emerging, we must also deal with one another.
In recent months, Joe Biden has been on rocky ground with allies around the world. This week, he went to address the United Nations General Assembly to answer questions about what many critics around the world see as disappointments when it comes to his policies on Afghanistan, COVID, climate policy, and that U.S.-Australia nuclear subdeal. To help us break down Joe Biden's big week in New York at UNGA, we have RYAN HEATH, the host and author of Global Insider. One word, how would you describe UNGA this year?
Chaotic.
This is not the context. I think we would have predicted that Joe Biden would be addressing the UN, a set of swirling international crises and skepticism from America's closest allies. Tell us what were the expectations from leaders around the world and what they wanted to see from Biden and what he needed to do.
The thing about the UN General Assembly is it's not just the place for the big powers like the G7 or the G20. The whole world comes here. So a lot of small countries, all of the poorest and most vulnerable countries are there. And they really feel burned by the rich countries at the moment because they feel the effects of climate change and COVID. There's clearly not an equal vaccine rollout. Joe Biden has some nice words to say on both of these issues.
We are fixing our eyes on devoting our resources to the challenges that hold the keys to our collective future. Ending this pandemic, addressing the climate crisis.
But can these countries buy US-made vaccines on an open market? No. They have to rely on US charity because there is an export ban.
Break down for us what he had to say that was of any substance in the Tuesday speech.
He comes and talks about the importance of engaging deeply, and that even when you've got potential conflict or a problem with another major power like China, you've got to keep talking.
We've ended 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan. And as we close this period of relentless war, we're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy.
He did come and say that he would lift the European travel ban that has been in place for the last 18 months. But I was talking with European diplomats last night, and they said, well, what, that's supposed to be our win from the French humiliation?
Looming over this, of course, is that rift with France dealing with the submarine deal that scuttled France's $66 billion deal for diesel submarines for Australia.
We've got to talk a little bit about France. How is this being discussed?
I think it says that democracies are not on the same page regarding China. And Australia was pressed to take a side, and it took a side. The symbol of that is choosing to do this nuclear submarine deal. And now other European allies are going to be pushed to make the same sort of decision, basically. So I don't think it's so much about the French tantrum. It's about how is this sort of working to contain China going to unfold.
He previewed some additional aid regarding COVID. Will that take care of the criticism that the United States is being far too stingy when it comes to getting this vaccine to people who haven't had a first shot while we're on our third booster shot?
The medical reality is that there's no point having people in the US losing their immunity. That supply needs to increase in general. The promise to send a few more doses isn't going to crack that nut. These big countries, including the US, are playing at the edges instead of really going big and going hard or using the Defense Production Act to just completely ramp up the production of these vaccines.
There were a lot of conversations, Biden mentioned it in his speech, regarding aggressive climate goals, but there's also a sense that things are not going in the right direction.
Most countries really do agree that America is now pointing in the right direction, but now there are these big net zero visions for 2050, but we can't wait until 2050 to make those steep cuts.
I can't help but notice on the same day Biden is up in New York talking about his aggressive climate goal in the Senate, coal state Democrat Joe Manchin is still opposing the main tool that the Biden administration wants to pass into law to, move utility companies to use more clean energy.
Unless Congress is willing to bite, why would these smaller economies say, hey, we're going to make these huge cuts, and then actually just find out that America and China didn't do the heavy lifting? And so we wrecked our economies while you kept making tons of money.
So there's just a big gap between our rhetoric on the world stage and what Biden so far has been able to accomplish in Washington.
The people at UNGA, it's very clear to them that there's a huge gap between what John Kerry says when he jumps on a plane to visit them and what comes out of the sausage making machine in Congress.
On Afghanistan, there's obviously been a lot of talk about our closest allies being frustrated with what a mess it was and how allies felt that the communication was lacking, to say the least. But the drone strike that the Pentagon admitted to recently, how has that issue come up so far?
It hasn't been a factor in any of the conversations that I've been having. I think people are realistic that that sort of stuff was going on frequently and probably from many different angles in Afghanistan. In general, I think a lot of allies felt dragged into that war on terror. I think there's a sigh of relief that that's over.
A year from now, how will we know that Biden has, truly overcome this?
I think the two big crises are pretty clear. It's COVID and it's climate change. And the metrics are also quite clear. Either emissions are going down or they're going up. And the world has not been good at cutting those emissions. And then on COVID, either Africa has 4% vaccination rates or it's got something like 50 or 60 or 70% vaccination rates. They may not be as high as the US, but the gap now is ridiculous. So either it's a small gap or it's a big gap. So basically these emissions have to go down and the gap between America and Africa has to be much smaller on COVID. And it will be pretty clear whether that happened or not.